Hi, how's it going? My name is Andrew Miner and I'm going to be teaching you a little about science today. I'm going to first go into the scientific method and its individual 7 steps. I will then be comparing the difference between deductive versus inductive reasoning. I will then be going into the 3 different components of hypothesis, theory, and law and how they are different from each other. I will then provide examples for each of those 3 as well. First, let's start with the scientific method. Within the scientific method, there's going to be a total of 7 steps. The first step is observation. When you're making an observation, you're looking more deeply into something that interests you. This is where you're going to start to form a question, which is going to be the next step. But with this observation, it is important that you are truly interested in it because that's going to be the basis of your whole entire experiment. The next step to the scientific method is the questioning part. This is where you're forming a question on your observation that you have made, and you're overall trying to discover or find what you're trying to accomplish within your experiment. The third step is to create a hypothesis. This is when you're making an educated guess to why this thing that you observe occurs. Your hypothesis is either going to be supported or completely wrong based on your data that is produced through your experimentation. After you have your hypothesis, the next step is going to be conducting an experiment or providing tests to your hypothesis. It is important that you have your experiment completely detailed out of how you're going to conduct it with a detailed plan. And it is also important that you have your independent and dependent variable chosen so you know how one is going to affect the other. As you are conducting your testing, that's when the 5th component comes out. The 5th component is your data that is produced within the scientific method. Once your experiment is over with, you will then have your 6th component. This is your results. Your results are going to be all your data compiled. It is important that you have all of this organized in a meaningful way so you can interpret it best to your hypothesis. Once you have your results all organized, you will be able to fall into the final step, which is forming a conclusion. When you form a conclusion, you will be interpreting the data and seeing whether or not it will support your hypothesis. Either if it does or doesn't support your hypothesis, you will be able to arrive to a final statement that says whether or not your independent variable supports the dependent variable. Now we're going to move on to look at the differences between inductive and deductive reasoning. Before we look at their differences, it is important to note that scientists use both inductive and deductive reasoning within science. So inductive reasoning is the involvement of many individual observations to make a generalization. Many consider this approach to be moving from the bottom to the top. An example of inductive reasoning would be, Frank is a grandfather. Frank is bald. So therefore, all grandfathers are bald. So if you can't tell, there's a risk in this. The risk is that you're making a general conclusion made from specific observations, and they might not always be true. Whereas deductive reasoning starts with a general idea and determines whether it applies to a specific observation. This approach can be considered as from moving from the top down to the bottom. An example would be, since all humans are mortal, and I am a human, then I am mortal. Now we're going to go into the difference between a hypothesis, a theory, and a law. So first off, as we mentioned earlier, a hypothesis is basically an educated guess or an observation. An example of a hypothesis would be, if I drink soda for only a month, I will probably gain fat. And then a theory is an explanation of some aspect of the natural world. It is an organized system of accepted knowledge that applies in a variety of circumstances to explain a certain set of observations. An example of a theory would be Darwin's theory of evolution by means of natural selection. And then a law is described to be a sequence of events in nature that has been observed to occur in the same way, or they happen to occur in the same set of circumstances. An example of a law would be Isaac Newton's law of gravity. It is important to note that a hypothesis will eventually stem into a theory, and then a theory will eventually stem into a law. And those are the differences between hypothesis, theory, and law. I hope you overall learned a lot throughout this whole entire lesson, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your journey through learning about science.